From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, we welcome you to Balance of Power alongside Kaylee Lines. I'm Joe Matthew. We come to air a bit early this evening for an important conversation with Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. She joins us live now from Capitol Hill. Senator, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg. You're calling on the Senate to exercise its authority to stop President Trump's tariff regime here. Earlier today, as I'm sure you know, the president promised to veto the bill from Senators Cantwell and Grassley that would require congressional approval after 60 days. Now, John Thune says he doesn't think that bill has a future. So, Senator, what should be Congress's answer to the tariffs?
Well, let's back up just a little bit. As you've been reporting all day long, every light is flashing red in terms of the economy, and that we really are on the precipice of sliding into a recession and maybe taking it worldwide. Meanwhile, the Secretary of the Treasury is going on Tucker Carlson to talk about all of the workers that Trump and DOJ have illegally fired and spin some tale about how all those people from the Veterans Administration or the NIH or the Social Security Administration can go work in these factories that will magically appear. We need a Secretary of the Treasury who's in the real world, and in the real world right now, he should be calling a meeting of FSOC. Remember, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which is what we put in place after the crash in 2008. And this is the way that government, when the economy is doing what it's doing right now, the Secretary of the Treasury is supposed to pull everyone together and actually figure out a plan, call the plan, and then execute on the play. But that is not what our Secretary of the Treasury is doing. So that puts us in a position where Congress needs to act, and Congress can actually do it using the authority that Donald Trump himself is using. He's using something called IEPA, but the point is that if Congress says, no, there is no emergency here, then Donald Trump loses his ability to put all of these tariffs in place. So we need to act. We need a Secretary of Treasury to do his job. The Democrats in Congress are ready to act. But if the Secretary of Treasury won't act, then we need the Republicans to step up, join the Democrats, and put a halt to these tariffs that are truly wrecking the worldwide economy.
Well, Senator, the president argues it's going to help the U.S. economy, that this is actually about bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., protecting American workers, and lowering trade deficits with other countries. Is there something fundamentally wrong with that objective, or it's simply the means that you take issue with?
The objective is exactly one that I have advanced for years. Of course, tariffs should be one of our tools in the toolbox of economic policy. And there are times when appropriately executed that we could use a tariff, for example, to onshore a specific supply chain or to help build up manufacturing that we want to have here in the United States. But you do that in a thoughtful, integrated way. Instead of a haphazard number around tariffs applied to everyone with no thought at all about whether or not those tariffs will actually have a negative impact on manufacturing that's currently going on or any manufacturing that anybody might try to get underway. Instead of actually supporting manufacturing and good jobs, the way Donald Trump has done this has been to scare off anybody from investing here in the United States in any kind of facility that takes years to be able to build and expand and get it going. He's forcing people to pull back. That is not good for American workers. It is not good for building jobs here in America. It is not good for onshoring our manufacturing. You need a thoughtful policy, and that is the opposite of what Donald Trump has offered.
We heard from Larry Fink today, Senator. BlackRock CEO says he believes that a recession is already underway, that the CEOs he talks to say the same thing. Do you agree? And should the Federal Reserve announce an emergency rate cut tonight?
Look, I am really worried about whether we are already in a recession or just right on the edge. All of the lights are flashing red. And Larry Fink points this out, but he is not the only one. There are a lot of folks who are starting to say this, and a lot of evidence in that direction. Where our focus should be right now is on preventing it from getting any worse. And we can do that. You know, this isn't some outside shock. This is not some war in some distant land that's caused this problem. This is not that the markets are imploding because suddenly all of the bad mortgages are coming to light, like in 2008. One person has started the dumbest trade war in the history of America. Congress has the power to rein that back in. And if Donald Trump and his team won't do it, then Congress should step up and do it before more damage is done.
Well, does one person also have the power to provide a check on that damage? To get back to Joe's question, Senator, even if the Fed were to issue an emergency rate cut, would that be enough to stem all of the bleeding that you think could be happening in the U.S. economy as a result of these policies?
Look, the Fed chair himself on Friday just said that he is concerned that this haphazard tariff announcement is going to drive up inflation and drive up unemployment simultaneously. You know, I understand why the Fed chair is really worried at this moment. The one person who can stop this problem is Donald Trump. And if he will roll back these tariffs, we can at least stop the damage from continuing to bleed out through our economy and around the world. And if Trump won't do it, then we just need some Republicans in the House and the Senate to grow a backbone and do what they know is right. You know, I don't know anybody in Congress who's saying, man, this is a great idea. What a cool move. They are really worried about what's happening. They're hearing it from their own constituents at home. But they have the power to fix it. So let's put the pressure on those Republicans to join with the Democrats and take away the authority from Donald Trump to be able to continue to roll out a tariff policy that has the potential now to put millions of people out of work, cost millions of people their savings, their retirement, and start shutting down businesses throughout this country.
Looking at a letter that you sent, in fact, led senators signed by all 11 Democrats on the banking committee. It's to the chairman, Tim Scott, demanding a hearing on the impact of President Trump's trade war. I mention this because you're going to be involved in a hearing tomorrow, Senate Finance Committee, with the U.S. Trade Representative, Jamieson Greer, who I can't imagine realized the timing of this hearing when your invitation first went out. Is that the person you want to talk to? Who else would you bring before the banking committee, if not the president himself?
You bet. I am ready to talk to Mr. Greer tomorrow about what we can do right now to stop the bleeding, what we can do to try to rescue this economy before it is hopelessly caught in a recession. I want to ask that of Mr. Jamieson, and I'm going to ask him what it's going to take him to step up and tell the president to stop this tariff policy that is terrible for workers all across this country.
Well, I wonder then, Senator, how much authority you really think the U.S. Trade Representative has, or how much sway in impacting the president's decisions. I could ask the same about the Secretary of the Treasury, of the Commerce Department, of others for that matter.
Well, you know, I hope you're listening to your own question, and that is, these are the very people that Donald Trump said were the best people to do policy in each of their chosen areas. Donald Trump's the one who chose his trade rep. Donald Trump is the one who chose his Secretary of the Treasury. By golly, they ought to be doing their jobs right now. Instead of having the Secretary of the Treasury go on Tucker Carlson and spin out fantasies, he ought to be calling together the rest of the economic advisors under the powers given him under Dodd-Frank, putting them together and putting a plan in place to rescue this economy. That's what the FSOC, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, was deliberately built for. And that is the job that was given to the Secretary of Treasury. Step up and do your job. And if Donald Trump has any, Donald Trump should listen to his Secretary of Treasury if his Secretary of Treasury will do his job. That is the question. And if none of them will do their jobs, Congress needs to do its job and take away this authority from Donald Trump. And I just want to be clear, we're running out of time on this. Every single day that goes by, every hour that people are saying, I'm not investing there, I'm laying off workers, every single minute, it gets more and more dangerous for our economy and for the worldwide economy. It is time for the Secretary of the Treasury to do his job. It is time for the President to do his job. And it is time for Congress to do its job.
All right, Senator, we will leave it on that note. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts joining us here on Balance of Power. Now, as we consider how the president's policies are influencing financial markets, we want to take you through the whipsawing action we saw today and turn to our colleague Romaine Bostick, who is joining us from New York. So, Romaine, for all of the incredible swings, we actually ended up not that much down on the day.
Yeah, it's really not about where we close or even where we open, Kaylee, but kind of what happened in between. The S&P only closed lower by about 0.2%. You compare that to the 5% drops that we had the last couple of days, that may not seem as much. But from peak to trough, meaning the lowest point on the day in the S&P to the highest point of the day in the S&P, we had an 8.5 percentage point swing. That's the second widest swing that we've had on the S&P on a percentage point basis since at least the global financial crisis. On a points basis, there has been no day where we saw that type of swing. And I think it gets to this idea, Kaylee, of kind of what I think Elizabeth Warren was touching on, this idea of sort of what is the response to the response. Is it Congress? Is it Scott Bessent and some of the other folks in the White House? This is what the market was really trying to suss out. One of the reasons why you got that swing, Kaylee, was right around 10 a.m. this morning, Washington time. There was a tweet that went out, a social media post that seemed to suggest that the president was willing to grant a 90-day reprieve on these tariffs. Now, the White House came out very quickly and said the president did not say that. This is coming from a fraudulent source. Nevertheless, the market really took off on that. And it gives you a sense here of where sentiment is at. The market does not like this. You see on your screen there, Kimball Musk does not like this. This is the younger brother of Elon Musk. He sits on the board of Tesla as well as some of the other Elon Musk enterprises here, making it clear he's also against the tariffs. And I think you're getting to the point now where some people are starting to say the quiet part out loud, whether it's Druckenmiller, whether it's Jamie Dimon, whether it's Larry Fink. A lot of big heavyweights out there are now finally speaking up and saying what I think a lot of us know, that at least right now in the interim, they're not comfortable with this. I guess the question, Joe and Kaylee, becomes whether the market can find some comfort with this, precisely because the president seems to suggest that these tariffs aren't going away anytime soon.
Yeah, we know Elon himself isn't a fan either, Romaine. You know, it's something, though, going through what we saw this morning, it makes you wonder if this market is a coiled spring, if it's just waiting for good news to start rallying. But as soon as I say that, you're looking at a VIX that's sitting right under 47. How do we rationalize it?
You rationalize that by saying, no, it's not necessarily the coiled spring. There are people in there willing to buy, Joe, but a VIX elevated like this is unusual for it to stay elevated. You get VIX spikes, and then it typically reverts to the mean. That's not happening. I also want to point out Gina Martin-Adams, who leads our equity strategy for Bloomberg Intelligence, made it clear she actually thinks there will be an earnings recession, not necessarily an economic recession, but that earnings for the S&P 500 will contract. That will have a negative sign. That's not good for market valuations, Joe, if you are coming in to buy this dip.
Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick with us in the clutch. Once again, we thank you, Romaine, and it's still just Monday. Joining us now for a look at how the White House is responding to the global tariff reaction is Bloomberg's Washington correspondent, Tyler Kendall. Tyler, it's been a busy day there with the visit from the Israeli Prime Minister.
Yeah, hey, Joe. Well, I actually had the chance to catch up with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent a short time ago, and I asked him if we could expect any tariff deals ahead of April 9th, and he told me, quote, likely not. I then asked him if countries could expect to see tariff barriers by the U.S. dropped below the 10% floor that's currently in place. And he said everything's on the table as they begin these negotiations. Now, importantly, President Trump in the Oval Office earlier today saying he has no plans to pause the tariffs, and that it's going to take more from countries than just lowering their tariff barriers to strike a deal with this White House.
We have many countries that are coming to negotiate deals with us, and they're going to be fair deals, and in certain cases they're going to be paying substantial tariffs. There can be permanent tariffs, and there can also be negotiations, because there are things that we need beyond tariffs.
These comments after some mixed messages from this White House as the administration pushes this is for long-term growth. In an op-ed today, the president's chief trade advisor, Peter Navarro, saying this is not a negotiation. We've heard officials in recent days double down any exemptions or carve-outs could undermine investment in reshoring manufacturing. But then those comments were followed by this post from the Treasury Secretary, who said he looks forward to, quote, upcoming productive engagement with Japan after the country's prime minister held a call with President Trump this morning. Now, Joe and Kaylee, White House officials say that as many as 70 countries have reached out to the U.S. to negotiate. When I asked the Treasury Secretary if he was optimistic about any other countries beyond Japan, he said that he was about all of them. We would be remiss if we didn't mention, though, today, Joe and Kaylee, President Trump threatening an additional 50% tariff when it comes to China if they don't back down on their retaliation plans by tomorrow.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall at the White House. Thank you so much. And it is exactly that we'll talk about still ahead. President Trump's threat to impose that additional 50% tariff rate on China. Mary Lovely of the Peterson Institute for International Economics will join us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
With China, as you know, against my statement, they put a 34% tariff on above what their ridiculous tariffs were already. And I said, if that tariff isn't removed by tomorrow at 12 o'clock, we're putting a 50% tariff on above the tariffs that we put on. I have a great relationship with President Xi. I hope it's going to stay that way. I have great respect for China. China is essentially a closed country. In fact, it is a closed country, and what they do is they charge tariffs so that if you sell cars or if you sell anything, nobody's going to buy it because the price is out of control.
President Trump in the Oval Office earlier restating his threat to raise the cumulative tariff rate on Chinese imports to effectively 104% unless Beijing backs down from its retaliatory measures against the U.S. And joining us now for more on Bloomberg TV and radio is Mary Lovely, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Mary, thank you so much for being here. The president suggests this will all take effect on Wednesday unless China rolls back or does not impose its own retaliatory tariffs. What happens if neither side blinks here?
Wow, this is just such a huge experiment on a global scale. Well, let's think about what might happen. You mentioned that the tariffs that President Trump has imposed this time are up to about 104%, but for many products, that's on top of a set of other tariffs, the trade war tariffs, plus countervailing duties and anti-dumping. And some products are going to be up above 120%. Well, for many businesses, that will be prohibitive. And we may just see a stop or a paralyzing of trade. Certainly, this won't affect us immediately. There's a lot of inventory in the United States. There's goods on the water already. But you can imagine that supply simply cannot respond, not in the magnitude of the sheer volume of goods that we get from China. Supply cannot respond in any, short-term fashion.
Well, so let's just continue on with this 104% to 120%. As you mentioned, Mary, what would that look like, or would it just simply be the end of our trade relationship?
Well, I mean, over the long term, if we could have substitutes for China, we would see what happened during the first trade war, which is that trade would begin to go around China, either by new countries, especially other upper middle income countries, coming on as suppliers, some revitalization or new domestic supply, and China investing in these third countries. But now with this matrix of tariffs, particularly on the types of countries that would be best equipped to be substitutes for China, and which we saw under the Biden administration, a kind of wooing of these countries, places like Vietnam for electronics, Mexico for electronics, Bangladesh coming on extremely strong in clothing. Without these places being able to handle the tariffs, the large tariffs that were placed on them, it's really unknown where these goods will be sourced from.
Well, and it strikes me, Mary, that China's potential means of responding to President Trump's policies don't just begin and end with tariffs. They could manipulate their currency, perhaps, if they so choose. They could make it very difficult for American companies to do business in China. Would you expect that if this additional 50% tariff rate were to go into effect Wednesday, that is what we would see next from Beijing?
I think Beijing will act in its own interest, as it always does. I don't think either of those two actions are actually their best choices. I think they see those as more harmful than helpful. I think they could clearly go at things like supplies of rare earths. There's many products in the chemical pharma area that are dependent on China. We have a lot of dependencies that we haven't been able to remove, and China could go at some of those. It's also eager to keep foreign direct investment in China, so it could particularly strike out at companies that it sees as military, somehow helping with military or tech. We've seen the U.S. put a lot of military-aligned Chinese companies on entity lists, and we're seeing China moving to a tit for tat in that area as well.
I want to ask you about Vietnam, as you mentioned. It's something that Peter Navarro talks about a lot on Fox News yesterday, the senior counselor for trade and manufacturing. He's got the president's ear on all of this. Spoke to the trade deficit with Vietnam, suggesting that this is about a lot more than tariffs. Listen.
If you simply lowered our tariffs and they lowered our tariffs to zero, we'd still run about a $120 billion trade deficit with Vietnam. And the problem is all of the non-tariff cheating that they do.
Non-tariff cheating, suggesting that Vietnam is laundering goods from China that somehow make their way here to the U.S. Do tariffs stop that from happening?
No, only enforcement stops that from happening. And of course, we know that the Customs and Border Patrol are vastly underfunded, especially for given the extra responsibility and enforcement efforts that are going to be necessary. I think that the administration is kind of using funny numbers here. I have no idea how they would calculate that number. And Vietnam has been eager to show the United States that they're not just being used to relabel Chinese goods. Why? Because they want to maintain, they need to maintain the U.S. as a place for them to sell their manufacturers as they try to climb up the development ladder.
Well, when it gets back to the notion of what we're hearing from Navarro and others in the administration, Mary, that this isn't just about tariffs, but actually that they want a reduction in the U.S. trade deficit with these countries. To what extent is trade deficit reduction actually achievable with some of these trade partners that we're talking about?
It doesn't make any sense to tackle the trade deficit country by country or bilaterally, the way they are doing it. We are going to find that the surefire way to reduce that trade deficit is a U.S. recession, unfortunately. We will see instead the deficit move around. So, one of the things is take natural rubber. My colleague Maury Obstfeld has used this example. It's a very good one. Thailand has a certain tariff now. Indonesia, Cote d'Ivoire has a lower tariff. So people will start to buy natural rubber from Cote d'Ivoire. The trade deficit associated with that, because we don't sell any natural rubber, will go to Cote d'Ivoire. What does the administration do then? Does it increase the tariff then on Cote d'Ivoire? We don't know. So again, it's kind of going to be like whack-a-mole. The only way to really reduce the trade deficit is to change the macroeconomic imbalance, the balance between what we're spending and consumption and what we earn in terms of GDP. And the surefire way to blow a big hole in that gap is to have a large federal budget deficit. And unfortunately, this administration is on track to greatly increase the federal budget deficit. So while they're saying they're going to do this with this, bilateral tariff economics, in the meantime, we're probably, unless we hit recession, and I certainly hope we don't, we're going to see a bigger trade deficit, not a smaller one.
Mary, it's great to have you back. Mary Lovely is Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. We thank you for the insights. Coming up, we'll continue our conversation here on the global tariff reaction, get into the economic implications with Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum. He's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
What's going to happen with the market, I can't tell you, but I can tell you our country has gotten a lot stronger. And eventually, it'll be a country like no other. It'll be the most dominant country economically in the world. But sometimes you have to take medicine to fix something.
President Trump at altitude, talking to reporters aboard Air Force One yesterday, and the market's reaction to the tariffs. Take your medicine, he said. For more on how the economy as a whole is reacting to the global trade upheaval, we turn to Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who's president of the American Action Forum. Douglas, great to have you back. The president wrote on Truth Social, "Don't be weak, don't be stupid, don't be a panican," he wrote. A new party based on weak and stupid people. Are you a panican?
No, but I'm a realist, and these are a very, very significant policy move. But if we really do need to figure out what they are, Joe, I mean, are they permanent? If they're permanent, which is what Peter Navarro says and what is necessary if you're genuinely going to get people to relocate, then they will also have their biggest negative domestic impact. People are going to look at this as a permanent rise in the cost of these goods. It's going to be passed along to consumers. It's a $400 billion tax. That's as large as the sunsets that we're trying to avoid next year of the 17 Act, taking place right now in an economy that may have a negative first quarter in the rearview mirror. None of that is good for the economy. On the other hand, could be they're all negotiable and they're not real. That's what you get from out of the movement of Bessent over to negotiate with Japan. If so, they won't get any of the supposed impacts on the trade deficits or relocation, but they'll do less immediate macroeconomic damage in the United States. I can't tell you the answer, and that's the problem.
Well, is it ultimately just our trading partners who are on the other side of this that need the answer? If it's both permanent and a negotiation, arguably that would affect the credibility of the conversations you're having with the administration.
I think our trading partners probably do want to know the answer, and one of my concerns is they're getting the same kind of clarity that you and I get watching the news all day. They may be telling one set of countries, oh, they're negotiable, and another set of countries, no, they're permanent. Then they compare notes and they think, well, what's going on here? And you need to have a clean message. You need to have a genuine position. I don't think we do at this point. And I do worry about what's going on with American firms who have to make investment plans. American consumers are trying to figure out their budgets and are trying to factor in the cost of tariffs. And the Federal Reserve, which is trying to sort through all this as well. They're creating a lot of uncertainty outside the U.S. and inside the U.S.
Interesting to hear from the Treasury Secretary yesterday. Douglas, he was on NBC's Meet the Press. Scott Bessent, when asked about the prospect of a recession, you can't get through a conversation in Washington without the R word coming up. Here's what he said.
I see no reason that we have to price in a recession. I reject the assumption. There doesn't have to be a recession. Who knows how the market is going to react in a day, in a week. What we are looking at is building the long-term economic fundamentals for prosperity that I think the previous administration had put us on a course toward financial calamity.
Fast forward to noontime today on Bloomberg, Larry Fink says the economy is weakening as we speak, probably in a recession right now. Who do you think is right?
I'm closer to Mr. Fink's position. I mean, there are two big non sequiturs there in the Secretary's answer. I mean, number one, there should be a reason to be concerned about a recession because we're working very hard to avoid a sunset of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It's a $420 billion tax increase in 2026. This is a $400 billion tax increase today. If you're concerned about the tax bill, you have to be concerned about this. And he went immediately to the market reaction, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the underlying market economy, real sales of goods and services. I mean, there's no question about that. And, I think Mr. Fink's, looked at it right. We had an economy that was weakening, and now we have this hit to it. I'd be concerned about the outlook over the next couple of quarters.
Douglas, Bloomberg reported today that some on Trump's team, though the president himself isn't necessarily read in or on board with this per our reporting, but that administration officials are considering creating a new exporter tax credit to help offset some of the negative impact of tariffs. We've heard suggestions that there may be subsidies for affected parties like farmers, like we saw in the 2018 trade war. If you have to subsidize or spend more money to offset some of the negative effects, does that not at least nullify a large portion of whatever revenue you're able to generate?
Well, that gets you. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. That gets you to the second non sequitur in that statement, which is, yes, we have an enormous fiscal problem. We are on an unsustainable trajectory. And this isn't going to solve it. If it puts us in a recession, there will be no fiscal tightening. And if you spend all the money trying to undo the damage you've done, you don't improve the fiscal position at all. So I'm unpersuaded by the notion that there's been anything like a serious effort to deal with the fiscal outlook. That needs to deal with the underlying large spending programs. They've said they're off limits. They're doing damaging tax increases instead. When they were not in the White House, they would have said that Democrats raising taxes is no way to solve our budget problems, but that's exactly what they're doing.
There's important work to be done on Capitol Hill that brings us to a former life of yours, Douglas, as head of the CBO, the House getting back with just about a week left to pass the Senate budget resolution that cleared over the weekend here. To what extent is this conversation about tariffs, the noise in the marketplace, the confusion here in Washington, potentially jeopardizing this process on reconciliation?
Well, I'm concerned about the progress on the process on reconciliation, and I hate to sound like a relentlessly negative person, but the process is supposed to be budget resolution in the House, budget resolution in the Senate, and then make decisions to make them match. They made no such decisions. They agreed each to pass resolutions that don't match and to move down and create legislation. All they're doing is kicking the can down the road. They have not come to terms with what they want to do on the tax bill in the United States. That makes it hard to believe that's going to be an antidote for this tariff problem.
All right, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum. Thank you so much, as always, for joining us. And coming up, we'll continue this conversation, how the economic blowback from the Trump administration's tariffs could impact Congress's budget reconciliation plans. We'll discuss that still ahead with Maya MacGuineas, president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We thank you for joining. Corporate borrowers are slamming the brakes on debt sales as President Trump's tariffs roil all asset classes. The freeze, including leveraged loans to refinance buyouts, commercial mortgage bonds, and investment-grade credit offerings, and gauges that measure risk in credit markets are flashing warning signals. Joining us now to walk through the tumult from Atlanta, Bloomberg's Eliza Ronalds-Hannon. Eliza, thanks for being with us. How bad could this get?
Well, what we're seeing now is that the normal course of business for debt capital markets has come to a complete pause. And that includes, these are the channels that are for raising money for general corporate purposes, growth initiatives, also to finance M&A transactions, and where it gets especially tricky, to refinance debt that is already outstanding for some of these leveraged companies.
Well, so when we consider highly leveraged companies, especially or just high yield debt, we're seeing a chart on Bloomberg TV, also can be found on YouTube, that just shows how CDS has kind of skyrocketed. You're seeing spreads widening in high yield as well. Just walk us through what the market signals are telling us about the actual risk of default here.
Yeah, the gauges for risk have gone haywire. They haven't even been stable enough for anyone to kind of work with that new assumption. But to answer your question about how bad it can get, what happens when these markets are shut down, for leverage companies in particular, if they have debt outstanding that they need to refinance, or if they have deals that have already been announced that they need to raise financing for, the window for those transactions isn't all that big. So a shutdown to these financing channels, even if it's temporary, can cause them to lose their opportunity to refinance and potentially have to go searching for higher risk or more expensive forms of financing, which only adds to a burden that's already putting them into this position in the first place.
All right, Bloomberg's Eliza Ronalds-Hannon, thank you so much for joining us. Now, another element of uncertainty for credit, equity, of all markets in kind that they have to contend with is the fate of tax cut legislation on Capitol Hill, with the House planning to take up a budget resolution this week after the Senate adopted one on Saturday. But several hard-right Republicans have balked at the upper chamber's version. We spoke about this with Republican Congressman Frank Lucas of Oklahoma on the early edition of Balance of Power today to talk about its actual prospects of passage.
The House needs to pass the budget resolution that the Senate has passed with our separate instructions so that we can get on with reconciliation, addressing the national debt, addressing spending, making sure that we don't have the most dramatic increase in taxes at the end of this year and the effect that that would have on the entire economy. There are a lot of pieces in play right just this moment. We need to focus.
Big sigh. And for more, we turn now to Maya MacGuineas, president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. So while obviously Congressman Lucas, Maya, would like to see this passed, his colleagues that have taken issue with the Senate instructions, a lot of them are people who are deficit hawks, who are actually worried about the higher deficit additive nature of the Senate bill compared to what the House already passed. Just walk us through how these numbers look different and how hard it might actually be to reconcile with the House's desire to make sure that any tax hikes are offset by spending cuts to a large degree.
Yeah, so let me just say, let's hope that the fiscal conservatives in the House stick to their guns, because this Senate bill, I never thought I'd see a budget resolution that was so awful, quite honestly. It is reckless in every sense of the word. And I was not a fan, I know, harsh words, I was not a fan of the House budget resolution. So both of these budgets, first, there's one clear point. With our debt at near record levels and every indicator warning that we need to do something, and everyone coming on the show and saying we have fiscal challenges, the one thing we should not do is pass plans to borrow more, let alone trillions more. And so the House budget and the Senate budget would both allow trillions more in borrowing. The Senate is going to get over $6 trillion once you count interest payments. Unfathomable, really. And so then you think, okay, are they willing to offset any of this? And over the next budget window, over 10 years, spending will be $86 trillion. The House was only willing to offset $2 trillion. And we thought that was crazy. How could you say $2 trillion out of $86 trillion? That's how much we as Republicans who want to shrink the size of government are going to cut spending. But then the Senate came along and said, nope, we're not going to do $2 trillion out of $86 trillion. We're going to do $4 billion with a B. It is less than a rounding error. So they're not looking at holding themselves accountable to anything. So if the House accepts what the Senate has put on the floor, they say, oh, we'll both go on our merry ways and work through these budgets. That is not what will happen. The Senate ends up having numbers that are binding, and they will end up they will roll the House, which is what they did last time when they were working on tax cuts in 2017, where the House wanted to be fiscally responsible, or at least more so, and the Senate would have none of it, and they ended up winning. And I can't imagine that at this moment, when there's so much uncertainty, so much damage, both potentially into what we see in the economy and also the fiscal situation, people would really go forward and make it worse.
So, Maya, Let's say President Trump called you on the phone right now, maybe during this conversation. He said, Maya, I've got Peter Navarro with me. We've decided to make the tariffs permanent. That goes for the 104% now we're laying on China. That will mean trillions of dollars coming into this country. As Peter Navarro says, tariffs are tax cuts. Would that help to pay for this? Would you vote for that bill knowing that money was coming in?
Well, that call shouldn't come to me. That call should be explained to the country, right? I think one of the big situations with the tariffs is that there's no certainty and there's no understanding of what the strategy is. There have been so many discussions of what the motivations for the tariffs are, and tariffs could be quite damaging for the economy. That's certainly the case. They could also raise a lot of revenue. And so if they explain what the strategy is, and it appears to be viable, and it makes sense with the other choices that they're making, you could calm down the economy and you could raise revenue there. There will be many disagreements about whether that's the right way or the wrong way to raise revenue. But from the single-minded approach of could it offset some of the tax cuts, if it were guaranteed to be permanent, and if it were done so in a way that if any of them were repealed, those tax cuts would also be scaled back at the same time. And if it were done in a way with conjunction with other things that it didn't harm the economy, certainly that could cause as an offset. It could work as a very effective offset. If it does anything damaging to the economy, though, that ends up undermining a lot of the good. You lose many of the revenues from other taxes, and you have a debt to GDP that starts to grow very quickly.
Well, and then what happens if you...
Much better. Sorry.
Well, I just wonder, Maya, no problem. We were just talking with Douglas Holtz-Eakin about this as well. Bloomberg's reporting that the administration, or at least officials within it, are looking at an exporter tax credit. Congressman Lucas, in our conversation with him earlier today, was talking about subsidies for farmers. If you actually have to spend more money to offset some of the impacts of tariffs, A, when you're trying to find these trillions of dollars in spending cuts potentially in reconciliation anyway, where do you find the money to offset those?
I mean, this is starting to lead to more and more fiscal giveaways, things that would require more borrowing. So we've heard it's not just extending the existing tax cuts. It's no tax on tips or no tax on seniors, no tax on income for anybody below $150,000. And then it starts being different policies of, oh, we need to help the farmers or we need to help the exporters. This becomes a huge patchwork of inefficient tax policy that is incredibly expensive and blows a massive hole in the debt. You want to put your tax policy together all in one fell swoop, one comprehensive tax plan that's as efficient as possible and raises enough revenue to pay for the spending that you want to do. The first step in that, of course, is pass a budget, which is something we almost never do. We need to see the White House's budget. But I think it's really important that we not just keep slapping on new Band-Aids and Band-Aids. That's going to make the entire system worse from an efficiency standpoint, and that uncertainty is so troubling because if what you're trying to do is attract manufacturing to this country, certainty is the name of the game. People will not be investing if they don't know what to expect.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the role that Medicaid cuts could play in this whole process, Maya. It's unclear how this will end up, but if in fact the legislation forces Medicaid cuts, they could be in the hundreds of billions, we're told. 3 states, Missouri, Oklahoma, and South Dakota, might have a real issue with that because they have state constitutions requiring that they participate in Medicaid expansion. So they either need a constitutional amendment or they need to start hacking into their state budgets here. Could Medicaid cuts actually keep this bill from passing overall?
Well, there's probably a lot of reasons that the Medicaid cuts, the proposed Medicaid cuts, could cause a problem because you have many, many moderates who are unwilling to look at that program for savings. And then you have some of these issues with the individual states, which would complicate it greatly. The problem I'm worried about is that we just keep taking things off the table. The president has said no Social Security and Medicare. You have many folks who are talking about why Medicaid can't work. We're going to have to cut government spending. All of those have areas of savings where we should be looking. And we're going to have to raise, not cut taxes. I don't relish always having to be the bearer of bad news because I know everybody else says, we'll give you tax cuts, we'll give you spending increases, but none of these are viable. And we've made so many promises to the public that people are sort of shocked with any of the choices, which is why we end up making none of them, which is why we have interest payments that are exploding and near record levels of debt. So I think on the Medicaid, they need to actually look at all of the different options where they can generate the savings. And you should be able to generate lots of savings in Medicaid without affecting beneficiaries. But I just worry that we keep making these political promises of this is going to be easy. When you're borrowing $2 trillion a year, it's not easy to fix it. And it's particularly not easy if you want to put another $4, $5, $6 trillion of tax cuts in place. What I do think they should do is look at the ways and means in the finance committees for more levels of savings. There are a lot of areas of the budget in those committees, both of which don't have enough savings in their instructions, where they could either alter the way the tax cuts work, get rid of some of the tax breaks, or look at other areas of savings in those jurisdictions.
The take from Maya MacGuineas, president of the Committee for the Responsible Federal Budget. Maya, it's great to have you back. Thank you. Coming up, our political panel weighs in on all of this, the president's reaction as well to the wild swings in the global market, the market's reaction to the president. It's all ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I hope Mr. Trump is smart enough to know that our economies are very much connected and that we depend on each other, and that tariffs are very bad for all of us.
This is a major turning point for the United States. Nonetheless, we stand ready to negotiate with the United States.
Propose a 0 for 0 for some industrial goods, for example. So we will see in the coming day how the negotiation, how the discussion is going forward. This will be a very important step. After that, we will have to discuss again together to see what can be the response.
I know that 27 are stronger than 1. And so if we keep united like we do for the moment, I'm trustful that at the end of the day, we'll find a good compromise.
European officials reacting to President Trump's reciprocal tariffs as the EU calibrates its retaliation. We're still waiting for details there as we now assemble our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis is with us, partner at Stone Court Capital, our Republican strategist, alongside Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Great to have you both here. Jeannie, we started our conversation this evening, started the program a bit early to spend some time with Senator Elizabeth Warren, who is urging her colleagues to try to stand up to President Trump and actually invoke the authority that Congress holds when it comes to the matter of tariffs. President Trump today says he'll veto any legislation that he gets from Capitol Hill. Is there a congressional answer?
There absolutely is. And, you know, I thought it was a fascinating conversation because, number one, she went right after the Treasury Secretary saying, do your job. And obviously the president. And then she said, if they won't do it, we will do it, meaning Congress. And they absolutely have the power. I mean, she mentioned it. The president took this power because he declared an emergency on the trade deficit. Well, we've had a trade deficit since the 1970s. Very, very tough to imagine that withstands scrutiny. And of course, in the absence of that emergency, Congress has the power to regulate taxation and commerce. Article 1, Section 8, everybody should go reread it, and so should Congress. So she's absolutely right. And those hearings you mentioned tomorrow, that is going to be fascinating because I think those are going to be tough hearings.
Well, the hearing Jeannie's alluding to, Rick, is the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer going to have to testify before the Senate Finance Committee. And I wonder what kind of message we get from him, because it seems that we're getting a bit of a different message from everyone in the administration. Peter Navarro pens an op-ed in the Financial Times saying this is not a negotiation. Minutes later, the Treasury Secretary announces the start of formal negotiations with Japan over tariffs. Then President Trump speaks in the Oval Office, Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel at his side, and says that it can be both permanent and a negotiation. So I'm not clear, Rick, are you?
Well, and Howard Ludwig takes both sides.
Yeah,
look, I'm sure they know what this is supposed to be, but it's not clear that they can communicate it with one voice. We know Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a negotiator. It's really who he is as an individual. So, of course, everything's going to be a negotiation. Peter Navarro probably is under the pressure to try and keep everyone's feet to the fire so that we don't have a renegade effort in Congress to strip away these powers. And so he has to go out there and be the bad guy. And you can hear the sawing on the limb that he's standing on, right? Saying, no, these are all going to be permanent and therefore creating manufacturing jobs. And this is going to restructure the entire world economy. So you can't have bringing in manufacturing from abroad, restructuring the entire global economy if you're going to negotiate all that away in the first 6 weeks of the tariff war. So it's an administration that is in search of a narrative that'll work for the people and the markets, and they can't find one.
That's quite an image. There's also the sound of the sawing on the limb that the economy is standing on right now, Jeannie, when you've got Larry Fink suggesting on Bloomberg that we're already in a recession. What that might mean months from now for President Trump, the political implications of an economic downturn in this case, that in that world he started.
That's right. I mean, the fact is the clock is ticking for President Trump, but he's not running for re-election. It's really those Republicans in Congress who have to be concerned. And that's why we're hearing the president say, don't be a panican, just relax. Everything will be fine. But the reality is that it's not going to be fine. And unlike Rick, I am not sure they know what they're doing. There is 250 years of economic research in the social sciences, which says this makes zero sense. And everybody, even ardent supporters like Bill Ackman, has come out and said, please, Mr. President, pull this back. Why? Because it doesn't make an ounce of sense. And so he can't pursue all these goals at once. And to Kayleigh, to your point, he sat there in front of Netanyahu today, and on the one hand said there's no negotiation, and on the other hand said we're negotiating. And by the way, the Secretary of the Treasury will be negotiating with Japan on Wednesday. Well, which is it, Mr. President? This is no way to make policy. And of course, Congress has to step in sooner rather than later, to Senator Warren's point.
But even if they decided they wanted to, Rick, the White House already issued a veto threat of legislation that would be seen to restrain his trade authority, even if that authority is supposed to rest with Congress. So why take the political risk if you're a Republican sitting in the Senate?
Because you may face re-election in 2026, and you're a little worried that your constituents see you doing nothing while, the stock market burns. So, and while their 401k disappears. Yeah. So everyone is kind of in search of that narrative that the White House is struggling with. And Congress has not been very aggressive in exerting their powers. And this is a way that they can at least look like they're trying to do something. I applaud the Republicans who have taken a position on this. They're a day late and a dollar short. Their real power was holding up conferees, people who were getting confirmed for cabinet jobs. They have an enormous amount of leverage to get what they want out of an administration. And they all just sort of put on their blinders and said, let's go. Now they're sort of rearguard action. And you're right. The president has ultimately the veto pen. And so he's going to get his way on this. And you will have some people walking down the aisle in the House of Representatives trying to force a vote there. Don Bacon's got a similar bill that the Senate has done. And he will have a lot of Republicans in the House who want to take that vote. Likely the Speaker won't allow that vote to ever be taken.
We've just got about a minute left here, Jeannie. We saw people take to the streets over the weekend. Hundreds of thousands in cities all over the country, including right here in the nation's capital. It's a pretty impressive display around the Washington Monument. Does that matter in 2025?
Oh, it absolutely does. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, Joe, because it's gone undercovered with all of what's going on in the markets. But hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets this weekend, expressing frustration, not just at the tariffs policy, although that was there, but to DOGE and so much else that has gone on in terms of the attacks on the courts and on big law firms and other things. So it's going to matter. Democrats and Republicans are hearing it from their constituents. But what matters most, of course, is the economy and those 401ks. And as people go to the store and pay higher prices, pending inflation and a recession, that matters the most. And Donald Trump cannot hide from that.
All right, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Rick Davis, our signature political panel. Thank you so much. And still ahead, as Jeannie was alluding to, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer set to testify before the Senate tomorrow. We'll look ahead to that next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I am ready to talk to Mr. Greer tomorrow about what we can do right now to stop the bleeding. what we can do to try to rescue this economy before it is hopelessly caught in a recession. I want to ask that of Mr. Jameson, and I'm going to ask him what it's going to take him to step up and tell the president to stop this tariff policy that is terrible for workers all across this country.
Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts on with us earlier this hour discussing U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, who is set to testify before the Senate Finance Committee tomorrow and very likely, Joe, to face some pretty tough questions on the eve of elevated reciprocal tariffs taking effect.
Gets two turns this week. Senate tomorrow, House side the next day, with hearings that may be a bit uncomfortable. This was not scheduled to talk about tariffs. We didn't know we'd be in the throes of this moment right now, but it could be interesting for the USTR. Check out for more the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
And we'll have the full readout for you tomorrow right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.